Hey folks, Brian Anderson here again. Let's continue working through the book of Ephesians. We are in chapter 2, and let's take a look at verses 8 and 9 today. And I'm just going to call this the mechanics of salvation. So this is what it says, verse 8. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not as a result of works, that no one may boast. Now, the first thing I want you to do in this passage is notice the prepositions. For by grace, by. For by grace you have been saved through faith. So salvation is by grace and through faith. It's not through grace and by faith. Those are two entirely different things. Salvation is by the grace of God, but it comes to us through faith. Now let's explore those ideas for a minute. For by grace you have been saved through faith. Let's just focus on for by grace you have been saved. There we are given the basis of our salvation. What is the basis of it? It's the grace of God. By grace you have been saved. What exactly is the grace of God? Let's take a look at some other passages in the book of Ephesians to see what Paul has to say about grace. In chapter 1, verse 6, he says, to the praise of the glory of his grace, which he freely bestowed on us in the beloved. So grace is freely bestowed by God. And then chapter 1, verse 7 and 8. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses according to the riches of his grace, which he lavished on us. So there we're told that God's grace is rich. He has these riches of grace. And what does God do with those riches of grace? He lavishes them upon us, upon believers. Here's someone's best attempt at a definition of the grace of God. Grace is God's unearned and undeserved favor to hell-deserving sinners. Now, let's take a look at that phrase, through faith. For by grace you have been saved through faith. Faith is the instrument or the channel that brings God's grace into contact with our lives. You remember the Passover in the Old Testament, Exodus 12? Do you remember when the children of Israel were told that they had to slay a lamb, and they had to take the blood of that lamb and take a hyssop branch and apply the blood to the hyssop, and then use the hyssop to sprinkle that blood on the doorposts, so that when the avenging angel came through, he would not destroy the firstborn that was in that house. The hyssop branch was what was used to apply the blood. And similarly, our faith is like that hyssop branch, because it's what we use to apply the grace of God to our lives. Faith is like a channel. It's like an instrument. If you were in the desert dying of thirst and you needed water badly, if someone were to give you a hose and turn on the spigot, you would have all the water you would need. But that hose is like faith. It's the channel through which the grace of God comes into our lives. So what is biblical faith? I'm going to define it this way. Biblical faith is belief plus trust in the truth of the gospel. It's belief plus trust. Now, I've always believed that someone could jump out of an airplane and he could survive because that parachute would keep him safe. But a few years ago, I actually trusted myself to a parachute. I actually jumped out of an airplane with a parachute, and I did survive because that parachute held me up and helped me land safely. There's a difference between believing something and trusting something. We are called not only to believe in Jesus Christ, but to entrust our eternity and our souls to Jesus Christ. Now the question comes to us, well, can we boast of this faith that we have? After all, it is my faith. It's not God's faith. I mean, God's not believing for me. I am believing. So can I take a little bit of credit for that? Well, chapter 2, verse 8 tells me, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God. Now, we'll get to that in a minute. We'll talk about what the gift of God is in just a minute. But let me just ask you this. If someone were to give you a watch, you're not going to boast about what you did to get that watch, are you? Because you really didn't do anything. They came up to you and said, I want to give you a watch. You didn't do anything but accept it. You just simply received it. Faith is like accepting what God has offered in the gospel. Some Christians believe God does about 99% of everything needed for salvation, but there is still that 1% that we have to do. And that is we have to contribute our faith to what God has done through Jesus Christ, and then salvation will be enacted. It'll become alive. It'll be actuated. But if we don't add our 1%, our faith to what God has done, then God's hands are tied. Now, is that really true? Jesus said in John 6:44, no man comes to me except the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. So even that coming to Christ, which is faith, is something that is the result of God drawing us. It is the very gift of God. So in what sense could we call faith God's gift? I would just say this. Faith is the voluntary, spontaneous, inevitable response of new birth. God gives a new heart in the new birth, and when he does, we believe. The new heart comes, faith flows from the new heart. If God did not regenerate us, we never would believe. Now the text goes on to say, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God. So let's examine that. What is not of ourselves? What is the gift of God that Paul's talking about? Well, there's a difficulty here because the word that is neuter in Greek, and the word faith is feminine in Greek. And a pronoun that should modify another word that has the same gender. But that and faith don't go together. For by grace you have been saved. Grace is also feminine. That doesn't go with that. So what is he referring to when he says, and that, not of yourselves, it is the gift of God? I believe what he's saying is all of the things that he's already mentioned in verse 8. Grace, faith, and salvation. The whole ball of wax is included in it is the gift of God. All of that is the gift of God. It's not of ourselves. Then he goes on to say, not as a result of works. In Romans 11, verse 6, it says, but if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of grace. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. You can't mix grace and works. They don't mix. Salvation is all of grace, all of the grace of God. And the reason is so that no one may boast. Grace glorifies God. Works glorify man. God hates boasting because boasting comes from a heart of pride, and God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. God designed salvation so that we can't steal any of the glory from God, and we can't take credit for what God has done. Not unto us, O Lord, but to thy name give glory. So there we have the mechanics of salvation. Let's give God the glory for what he has done.